Hey everyone, I'm Jack Fossett, and we're going to talk about how to get some great tones out of this classic amp sitting right next to me, the Fender Deluxe Reverb. This amp honestly needs no introduction from me. You see them everywhere in blues, country, and rock. They're very common in studios. They're very common among gigging guitarists, but there's a couple of great tricks that you can use to get the most out of this amplifier. So we're going to use a couple of different guitars, a couple different pedals, and try and see all the different ways that we can dial in some cool tones using this, and how to adjust to some of its tonal characteristics. So let's get started with some of my favorite tones here. Make sure you stay tuned to the end of the video because I'm going to turn this amp all the way up so you can hear what it sounds like wide open. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow the links below where you can listen to some music, and I hope you enjoy. All right, the Fender Deluxe Reverb. Many of you are going to be familiar with this amp, and for those of you that aren't, I'm sure that at some point one will come across your path. You see them all the time, and for good reason. They're extremely versatile amps. They are very portable. They have a great punchy tone, and due to the single 12-inch speaker and the wattage, there's kind of a lot you can do with them as far as getting classic Fender amp tones. The one kind of pervasive thing about this amplifier is that it is pretty bright. It doesn't have a lot of harsh overtones, but it is very bright, and it also has this really kind of glassy attack that really jumps off of your guitar. Now, I do want to mention really quick, this is the 65 reissue blackface. This one is from the late 90s. There are a number of different ones out there. Generally speaking, a Deluxe Reverb has a Deluxe Reverb tone. There might be little differences here and there, but the character is going to be pretty much the same. So hopefully these tips can kind of work across the board for a lot of you. And also I want you to think of any of the tips as a starting point, because we all have different gigging situations, different recording situations, different guitars, different playing styles. So, you know, if I say, hey, I like it with the knob set here, and you find it better with the knob tweaked a bit from there, absolutely play it how you like it. So I mentioned that this is a very bright amp and it has kind of a glassy response. Now, that can be great for gigging. This is one of those amps that will really cut through the mix. Now, all of the Fender Blackface and Silverface amps kind of have a similar characteristic of tone for the most part. I am making a generalization, but you know, when you're talking about the Deluxe Reverb, the Super Reverb, the Twin Reverb, the Vibrolux Reverb, and a bunch of these others, again, the character is very similar. It's kind of a matter of how the tone is focused. Again, the reason that I think this one works so well for gigging, and you see them so commonly, is it sits right in this kind of perfect spot where it's louder and it's got a little bit more punch than the Princeton, which is going to be the smaller one of the line, and it's way more portable than the next levels up, which are going to be like the Super Reverb or the Twin Reverb. The Vibrolux is kind of in there too, and there's of course other models. And also because it's about half the wattage of the Super, one of the unique things about this amp is it's got a different frequency range with a 12-inch speaker, and because it's lower wattage, you can really push it harder. Not necessarily to the point of breakup, but even just getting up to gig volume, your tubes are going to be working harder than they would in the Super, or certainly the Twin. So the amp is going to fill out a little bit more, and again, it just has more punch, and with that sort of sharp, glassy attack, this amp has no problem being heard. Supers, I love Super Reverbs, one of my favorite amps, but for instance, that amp doesn't do nearly as well in big groups because it has this really kind of constant lower mid thing going on, and it has this wider frequency response. This one, it just, again, it punches and it cuts more. It almost is like Fender tone with a slightly bit of almost like a voxy attack to it. Not Vox tone, but like a Vox attack to it. And one of the reasons that people have bought Vox amps over the years is because it cuts really well, you know, in a band setting. This one kind of gives you that same benefit. Here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes that glassy, sharp attack can be a little bit too much. So how do you handle it? Well, what I love to do, and what I'm doing in this video, which you've already been hearing, is stop me. If you've heard this one before, I like to plug into the low gain input, the number 2 input. Those of you who've watched my other tone tip videos, this is no shock to you. This is one of my favorite things to do on a lot of amplifiers. It settles some of the brash attack of the amplifier, gives you a little bit more sag, and it just allows you to sink in. It's a little bit more user-friendly, especially if you're playing in a smaller group, if you're playing at home by yourself doing some recording. I find that it just works much better to plug into the second input. Also, don't be afraid to dial back the treble. The way that I like to set the EQ on this, and I actually find it works great for both single coils and humbuckers, is to have the treble right around 3 and the bass right around 5. That into the second input. And there's even a third thing that I do here, and that is to keep the guitar volume and tone backed off just a little bit. I'm not talking a ton. I'm talking, you know, backed off to maybe 8.5, 9. Just a little bit to kind of take off a slight hint of that edge. And you heard that on the Les Paul when I was playing with the overdrive there. I started off with it wide open, backed it off just a little bit. Now, it sounds great with it wide open, certainly, but again, it just kind of gives you a little bit of more that settled tone slightly if you back it off slightly. And then what's a great trick is you always have that little tiny bit of extra, especially if you're playing live. If there's a point when you really need to cut through, ever notice that miraculously the band always somehow gets louder by the last song, and you really don't know how because nobody's turning up their volume? It just happens. Well, it's nice to have that little tiny little bit of tweak, and because of the way it affects your dynamics, it's even more than just this little tiny bump in volume, because it doesn't just bump up the volume slightly, it also brings back that edgy attack. Now, if you're playing in a big group, certainly the high gain input is not a bad thing. It's certainly usable, it's certainly great, especially if you're in a big group and you really need to cut through. Try out that high gain input. This is a loud amp, and it also has a lot of perceived volume. What am I talking about when I say perceived volume? That sounds ridiculous. Well, what I'm talking about, it has to do with that attack. let's talk about the Vox again for a quick minute. You ever notice that Vox AC30s just sound insanely loud, and that they sound louder than a 30-watt amp should sound? I would suggest that a Vox AC30 sounds louder than my Fender Bassman or Super Reverb, which are 45 watts. Why is that? Part of it is because of this perceived volume and because of the dynamics. And it's not always exactly kind of akin to wattage and everything, but those Vox amps just have such that sharp attack, that, you know, snap to it, that kind of sits on the surface. Whereas the Super and the Bassman, they have kind of a wider frequency response. They have more lower mids. They sink in a little bit more. That Vox just really punches you right in the face with its tone, whereas those kind of fill in the room more. This one has a lot of that perceived volume because it has that sharp attack. Now, I mentioned I'm going to get this turned all the way up. Now, in the room, I can handle it being next to it turned all the way up. It doesn't just absolutely, you know, shred your ears and things. I mean, it's really ridiculously loud. But when you're talking about gigging volume, there's still only a certain level you can get to, and you're probably, unless you're playing a really big stage and you have some kind of wiggle room with the sound guy, you're probably not going to get it up to the point where it's really breaking up on its own. So it is great as a pedal platform. So I'm using some pedals today, because also pedals are just associated with a lot of classic tones. So let's get back into some tones here. And what you just heard in the intro is I was playing the Telecaster clean and also threw in some of that really luscious tremolo. And then with the Les Paul, I was using a tube screamer. Now, with the tube screamer I'm using in this video is a Maxon Apex 808. It's a great tube screamer. You can check out my review of that if you want to learn more about that pedal. We're going to flip-flop those now. So now we're going to play the Les Paul clean and then add the tube screamer into this. And you'll hear it gets a really nice bluesy kind of drive with the Telecaster. The Les Paul gets this really nice kind of warm, bluesy, jazzy tone with just a nice kind of snap on the top end, but retains that nice warmth, again, using those tricks that I just mentioned. So let's hear some of these tones. Now, there's a third guitar that I'm going to be using in this video, and that is a Gretsch 612059 Nashville. Let's dive in with that guitar for a minute. Just want to play how beautiful the reverb in this amp sounds. This line of amps in general, and this one is no exception, these are the reverbs to compare other reverbs to, in my opinion. Just the best reverbs out there. I absolutely love the reverbs on this amp. So I'm going to turn up the reverb. You don't need to turn it up a ton. I turned it up to about 5, and it really lush and really just fills in, and it's a beautiful tone. Check out how great the reverb on this amp sounds. let's try it with some more tremolo. And I'm going to segue into some of the pedals here because I want to use a couple of pedals to accentuate the tremolo in different ways. I'm going to stick with the Gretsch here for starters. I'm going to use the tremolo, and I'm also going to use a compressor. And for this, I'm using a one control pale blue compressor. I'm cheating a little tiny bit because that pedal also has an EQ on it. It's a great compressor. Anyway, I'm going to use that. So we'll hear how it sounds with the Gretsch for kind of a country Americana tremolo tone, kind of a bluesy thing, Americana music. And then I'm going to switch, and the tremolo, if you really dime it, it can get you this really aggressive, choppy tremolo. So I'm going to switch to the Les Paul and use the Tube Screamer again, and show you how you can get more of a modern tremolo sound that's a very, very percussive one. So check out how the tremolo responds to a couple of different sounds and a couple of different pedals. On the subject of the compressor, compressors are one of the most popular pedals to use with this type of amp for country play. This is because of its snap and its punch and everything in that classic Fender tone. It really is an ideal country player's amp. And of course, using a compressor, with a clean kind of sound is a classic country tone. So now we're going to use that compressor with this guitar, the Telecaster, on the bridge pickup, try and get kind of a classic country tone using that setup. Before we wrap this up with the amp totally wide open here, I'm going to do one more tone just to show you with the Gretsch how it can kind of cover a lot of bases. And on that one, I'm using the tone switch, and I've also backed off the bass to 3, the treble's still at 3, and then really pulled the reverb to get a very warm, jazzy tone out of this amp. Alright folks, we are going to close out here with this amp wide open, going to use both the Telecaster and the Les Paul. Really gets a just punchy, aggressive, and it kind of gets a nice blend, almost slightly tweedish in a way, which surprised me, and I wonder if some of that comes from the punch and from the 12-inch speaker. But a great bluesy, classic rock, something that you could use in the studio very, very reasonably without blowing the walls off. Now for this, I'm going back into the high gain input, and I've just flattened out the EQ. EQ's on 5, just to kind of give you a real sort of that's what a lot of people like, is, you know, for kind of a frame of reference, so that you can hear what this amp sounds like absolutely wide open. Please let us know in the comments, if you're a Deluxe Reverb player, how do you like to dial it in? How do you like to use your Deluxe Reverb? Do you have any tips and tricks? These are not all the tips and tricks that you can do for using a Deluxe Reverb, so please let us know how you use it in the comments. Enjoy these last couple of tones. I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Remember to follow that link below where you can listen to some music, where you can hear recordings of these guitars and amplifiers that I use in my videos. Hope you enjoy the end here. We'll see you next time.